Imagine this, you're in a billion-dollar lawsuit against someone. You're accusing them of stealing your ideas, copying your designs, dragging them through courts on 4 continents. The judges are ruling in your favor, and the world is watching. And yet, every single day, you write them a check for millions of dollars because you literally cannot build your product without them. That's not hypothetical. That's Apple and Samsung. In 2011, Apple sued Samsung for what is called the most obvious copying in tech history. But here's the twist. Samsung was building the chips, the displays, the memory inside the iPhone. Apple's most important product was being put together using parts from the company it was trying to destroy in court. This is the story of the weirdest rivalry in technology, a war where both sides needed each other to survive. And it starts long before anyone throws a punch. Before Apple and Samsung became enemies, they were actually close partners. In the early 2000s, Samsung wasn't a smartphone company. It was a parts giant. They built displays, memory chips, processors, the hidden pieces that powered everything from laptops to MP3 players. And one of their biggest customers was Apple. When Steve Jobs needed flash memory for the iPod, he went to Samsung. When Apple designed the first iPhone, Samsung supplied the processors and the storage. Apple didn't just buy parts from Samsung, they depended on them. Samsung had the factories, the cutting-edge tech, the ability to deliver millions of parts on time. And Samsung, they loved it, of course. Apple was their dream customer, predictable, with big orders and good money. By the mid-2000s, Apple was one of Samsung's largest customers, worth billions in yearly sales. Steve Jobs even visited Samsung's headquarters in South Korea. There are photos of him shaking hands with Samsung executives, touring factories, talking about future projects. Apple's got reliability and Samsung's got respect and profit. But then something changed. Apple didn't just want to buy parts anymore. They wanted to change an entire industry, and Samsung was paying very close attention. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in San Francisco and says 5 words that will change everything. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the iPhone. And he wasn't lying. The iPhone had no physical keyboard and no stylus, just a huge touchscreen and a grid of colorful icons. It was simple, beautiful, and groundbreaking. The audience gasped, competitors panicked, and Samsung watched very carefully. At the time, Samsung was selling flip phones and basic touchscreen devices running Windows Mobile. They were doing well, but nothing like what Apple just shown off. The iPhone wasn't just a better phone, it was something completely different. Now, here's where things get a little messy. Samsung didn't just see the iPhone as competition, they saw it as a roadmap. Within months, Samsung began changing direction fast. They started developing their own touchscreen smartphones, but they didn't build their own operating system. Instead, they partnered with Google, which was developing Android. By 2009, Samsung released the Galaxy lineup, and it looked familiar. The Galaxy phones had large touchscreens, grids of icons, rounded corners, and a black glass front. Even the box looked similar. The phones weren't exactly like the iPhone, but the style was hard to miss. Apple had spent years perfecting a vision. Samsung had studied that vision and shipped their version in a fraction of the time. Steve Jobs was furious. He reportedly told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, "I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product." He wasn't just talking about Google, he was talking about Samsung. On April 15th, 2011, Apple filed a lawsuit against Samsung in a US federal court. The claim was simple and brutal. Samsung had copied the iPhone. Apple's legal case wasn't just about technology, it was about design. They accused Samsung of stealing design patents. Things like the rounded corners of the iPhone, the grid layout of app icons, the black rectangle shape with a single home button. Apple also claimed Samsung copied software features, the bounce back effect when you scroll to the end of a page, pinch to zoom gestures, even the way icons wiggle when you try to delete them. This wasn't just a normal patent fight. Apple was arguing that Samsung had copied the iPhone's soul, including the way it looked, the way it felt, and the whole experience. Samsung hit back immediately. They countersued, claiming Apple had stolen their wireless technology patents. Samsung argued that Apple couldn't have built the iPhone without using tech Samsung had developed years earlier. If Apple wanted to play the patent game, Samsung had plenty of ammunition. What followed was a legal war bigger than anything the tech industry had ever seen. The lawsuits spread across the world: the US, South Korea, Germany, Japan, Australia, and the UK. There were trials, appeals, countersuits, and product bans all happening at once. In 2012, a US jury awarded Apple over $1 billion in damages. Samsung phones were temporarily banned from sale in some countries. Apple's legal team showed internal Samsung documents with side-by-side comparisons of the iPhone and planned Galaxy designs, with notes on how to match Apple's approach. It was brutal, public, and personal. But here's the part that made the whole situation crazy. While all of this was happening, Apple was still buying parts from Samsung. Billions of dollars worth every quarter. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the story stops being about pride and starts being about survival. Even as Apple was suing Samsung in court, Samsung was supplying the processors for the iPhone 4, iPhone 4S, and iPhone 5. Samsung was also providing flash memory and RAM. These weren't small parts. These were the brain and the storage of the device. Without Samsung, Apple couldn't build the iPhone at the scale it needed. And Samsung, they were making a fortune. Estimates suggest Samsung earned between 5 and 10 billion per year just from iPhone parts during the peak of the lawsuit. That's more profit than most smartphone companies make from selling actual products. Apple tried to break free. They partnered with TSMC to make future chips. They worked with other suppliers for memory. But honestly, changes like that take years. Chip manufacturing is one of the most complicated, expensive industries in the world. I mean, you can't just switch suppliers overnight. So Apple kept paying Samsung, and Samsung kept shipping parts. Engineers from both companies had to work together to make sure the chips fit perfectly, the displays met Apple's color standards, and the memory worked flawlessly. They had technical meetings and joint planning sessions, all while their legal teams were fighting in court. It was a forced partnership. They hated each other, but they needed each other. And both sides knew it. Samsung's parts business gave them power. Apple's scale gave them leverage. Neither could afford to destroy the other, because doing so would mean destroying themselves. This wasn't a rivalry, it was a hostage situation. But then someone else walks into the room, and suddenly Apple and Samsung had a much bigger problem. By 2016, a Chinese company called Huawei was growing incredibly fast. They were shipping hundreds of millions of smartphones, cutting prices, spending billions on research, and grabbing market share in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Huawei wasn't playing by the old rules. They were aggressive, innovative, and they didn't care about Apple's design style or Samsung's patents. For the first time, both Apple and Samsung were losing ground to the same competitor. Huawei briefly became the second largest smartphone maker in the world, behind Samsung but ahead of Apple. Other Chinese brands were rising too. The smartphone market wasn't just Apple versus Samsung anymore. It was a battlefield, and Apple and Samsung were bleeding market share. Here's what's interesting. The lawsuit started to fade, not because anyone won, not because they made peace, but because fighting each other became a distraction. In 2018, Apple and Samsung settled most of their remaining legal fights. The details were kept secret, but the message was clear. The war was over. Not because they liked each other, not because anyone apologized, but because the world had moved on. And if they kept fighting each other, someone else would win. So here's what actually happened. Apple and Samsung fought the most public, most expensive corporate legal battle in tech tech history. They accused each other of theft, filed lawsuits on 4 continents, banned each other's products, and spent billions in legal fees. And through it all, they kept doing business because they had to. Today, Samsung still supplies parts for the iPhone. Not as many as before, but they're still there. Apple still competes directly with Samsung's Galaxy lineup. They still try to steal each other's customers. They still take shots at each other in presentations. But the hatred, the destroy each other at all cost attitude, that's gone because they learned something the hard way. In business, you don't need to like your rival. You just need to know when fighting them costs more than it's worth. Apple and Samsung didn't become friends, they became smart. And maybe that's the most important lesson in all of this. The biggest rivalries in tech don't end with one side winning and the other losing. They end when both sides realize they're not each other's biggest threat anymore. Apple and Samsung went to war, but they stayed in business. And when a bigger enemy showed up, they stopped trying to kill each other and started trying to survive. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe to see more tech stories like this, and I will see you in the next video.